She didn't disappear. She just found a place where she could finally breathe. The garage smelled like motor oil and warm metal, the kind that clung to your clothes long after you left, the kind most people avoided without a second thought. But Marcus Reed barely noticed it anymore as he wiped his hands on a worn gray rag. The fabric darkened from years of honest work, while late afternoon light slipped through the half-open shutter door in thin golden lines, cutting across the concrete floor like quiet reminders that the day was ending whether he was ready or not. And in the corner, sitting cross-legged beside a small stack of children's books, his daughter Naomi traced her fingers slowly under each word as she whispered them out loud. Careful, deliberate, like someone honoring something fragile. And then she paused, looked up at him, and asked in a voice too soft for a child her age, "Dad, is she coming back today?" Marcus didn't answer right away, not because he didn't hear her, but because he did, and the question settled into the room heavier than the hum of the old ceiling fan above them, heavier than the silence that followed, and he glanced at the empty stool near the workbench, the one that hadn't been moved in weeks. Not since the last time someone had sat there without saying much, just listening, just being, and he swallowed slowly before finally walking over to Naomi, crouching down beside her. His movements steady, unhurried, like everything else about him, and he gently adjusted the book in her lap instead of answering directly. His voice low, grounded. "Finish the page first," he said, and she nodded, trusting him in the way children do when they don't yet understand absence. Only rhythm, only presence. And outside, a car passed by, its tires hissing softly against the pavement, a sound that faded just as quickly as it came, and Marcus stood back up, his eyes drifting once more to that empty stool, then to a small notebook tucked beneath a stack of receipts on the counter, its edges worn, its cover slightly bent, like it had been opened and closed more times than it could count. And for a moment, he reached for it, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air before pulling back, choosing instead to pick up a wrench, returning to the engine in front of him, because some things didn't need to be opened every day to still be alive. And across town, miles away in a place where silence felt different, where it echoed instead of settled, a black car rolled slowly to a stop near a quiet cemetery, its polished surface reflecting a sky just beginning to dim, and inside, a woman sat perfectly still, her hand gripping the door handle, but not moving, as if stepping out would make something final that she wasn't ready to accept. While beside her, a man stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his breath controlled, both of them surrounded by a kind of grief that didn't speak, didn't explain, only lingered, and neither of them knew that somewhere in a small garage filled with the scent of oil and old stories, a part of the person they had lost was still being read out loud, one careful word at a time. The cemetery was quieter than Evelyn Carter remembered, not silent, but softened, as if even the wind understood where it was allowed to go and where it should not linger. And when she finally opened the car door, the sound felt too loud against the stillness, making her pause for a brief second before stepping out, her heels pressing carefully into the gravel path as though each step needed permission, while Richard followed a moment later, closing his door with more control than force, his eyes scanning the space not out of curiosity but habit, a man used to managing environments that could be controlled, though this one could not, and together they walked side by side without touching, without speaking, toward the row where a small white headstone stood among others that looked almost identical if you did not know the names, and Evelyn's hand tightened slightly around the bouquet she carried. White lilies, her choice, always her choice, even now, and when they reached the grave. She lowered herself slowly, carefully, like she was entering a space that required reverence beyond motion, placing the flowers at the base and brushing a speck of dust from the engraved name with her fingertips, her breath catching not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet interruption, as if her body had forgotten how to continue for a second, while Richard remained standing just behind her, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture straight, almost formal, as though grief for him had rules. And for a while neither of them said anything, the kind of silence that had become familiar over time, heavy but structured, until Evelyn finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were supposed to have lunch today," she said, not looking up, not expecting an answer, and Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, measured, We can still sit, he replied, gesturing faintly toward a nearby bench, but she shook her head, a small movement that ended the suggestion before it could become real. And just then, footsteps approached from behind, unhurried, steady, not trying to be quiet but not disruptive either, and Richard turned first, his expression tightening slightly as he saw a man he did not recognize walking along the path with a young boy beside him. The man's jacket worn at the edges, his hands rough even from a distance, while the boy looked around with a kind of openness that did not belong to this place. And as they drew closer, Evelyn glanced back as well, her eyes narrowing not in fear, but in confusion, trying to place a connection that did not immediately exist, and the man stopped a few feet away from the grave, giving space without being told, his gaze resting briefly on the name carved into the stone before shifting toward the flowers, then toward Evelyn, and for a moment, no one spoke, the air holding something unspoken, something waiting, until the boy tugged lightly at the man's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, is this where she rests?" And the question hung there, fragile, unfamiliar, and Evelyn's posture stiffened almost instantly, her hand pressing against the edge of the headstone as she stood up slowly, turning fully now to face them, her voice calm, but edged with something sharper beneath. "Do we know you?" she asked, and the man did not step closer, did not retreat either. He simply stood where he was, grounded, present, his expression steady in a way that did not challenge but did not apologize, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet weight it had held before, the kind that did not rush to fill space. "No," he said gently, "but she knew us." And that was when Richard's gaze hardened, not out of anger but out of instinct, the immediate need to protect, to define boundaries that had been crossed without permission, even if unintentionally, and the distance between them, just a few feet of gravel and air, suddenly felt much larger, filled with questions that had not yet been asked and answers that had not yet been given. Richard stepped slightly forward, just enough to place himself between the man and Evelyn without making it obvious, a movement practiced over years of boardrooms and private negotiations, where control was never announced but always established, and his voice followed the same pattern, calm on the surface, firm underneath. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said, his eyes fixed on the man's face, searching for intent, for motive, for anything that could be measured and categorized. But what he found instead was something that did not fit into any of his usual frameworks, because Marcus Reed did not look like someone trying to take advantage of a moment, nor someone intimidated by the space he had stepped into. He simply stood there with a quiet steadiness, his hand resting lightly on his son's shoulder, grounding the boy without drawing attention to it, while the child himself looked past the tension, his gaze drifting back to the headstone as if it held something familiar, something he had been told about but never fully seen. And Evelyn noticed that, the way the boy's expression softened instead of stiffened, and it unsettled her more than anything else, because grief, in her world, was supposed to be contained, private, controlled, not shared with strangers who spoke as if they belonged in its center, and she straightened slightly, her fingers brushing against the side of her coat as if anchoring herself. "What do you mean? She knew you?" she asked, her voice more direct now, though still restrained, and Marcus did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because he chose his moments carefully, the same way he chose when to speak and when to let silence carry meaning, and he glanced down briefly at his son before looking back at Evelyn. "She used to come by," he said, his tone even, unembellished, "to my shop." And Richard let out a small breath that was almost a scoff but stopped short of becoming one, the kind of reaction that dismissed without fully engaging. "Our daughter did not spend time in auto repair shops," he replied, each word precise, shaped by certainty rather than curiosity. And Marcus nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what had just been revealed, not about Lily, but about the distance between who she was and who they believed her to be. And he did not argue, did not push back. He simply reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, handled often but carefully, and for a moment he held it between his fingers without extending it, as if weighing whether this was the right time, the right place. And Naomi looked up at him again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," she said. She liked the quiet there. "Remember, and the words slipped into the space between them with a softness that carried more weight than volume. And Evelyn's eyes flickered, just for a second, something shifting behind them. Because quiet was not something she associated with her daughter's life, not in the house filled with meetings and calls and expectations, not in the schedule that had always been full, always structured, always moving. And yet the way the child said it, without hesitation, without doubt, felt real in a way that made her chest tighten unexpectedly. And Marcus finally extended the folded paper, holding it out not toward Richard, but toward Evelyn, his arm steady, his expression unchanged, and after a brief pause, she reached for it, her fingers brushing against his for the smallest fraction of a second, a contact so light it could have been imagined. And when she unfolded it, the paper revealed a simple sketch, drawn in uneven pencil lines, a small garage, a stool, a figure sitting quietly with knees pulled close, and in the corner, written in handwriting she recognized instantly, but had not seen in weeks, were the words, "It is the only place I do not feel like I have to be someone else." And the world around her did not stop, not dramatically, not suddenly, but something inside her did, something that had been moving too fast for too long, finally forced to pause in the presence of a truth she had never been given the chance to hear. The paper trembled slightly in Evelyn's hands, not because of the wind, which had settled into a barely noticeable breeze, but because something inside her had shifted without warning. Something she had kept tightly ordered now loosening in a way she could not immediately control, and her eyes remained fixed on the handwriting, tracing each letter as if reading it again might change what it said. While Richard leaned closer, his posture no longer as rigid as before, his gaze narrowing not in skepticism this time, but in concentration, as though he were trying to reconcile this image with the version of their daughter he had constructed over years of expectations and carefully planned outcomes. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer defensive but uncertain, searching, until Evelyn finally lifted her eyes from the page and looked at Marcus, really looked this time, not at his clothes or his presence in a place she believed he did not belong, but at the calm in his expression, the absence of performance, and she asked quietly, why did she go there? The question carrying less accusation now, and more confusion, more need than she intended to reveal. And Marcus did not rush to answer, his gaze drifting briefly toward the headstone before returning to her. She did not come for the cars, he said, his voice steady, grounded in something that did not need to convince. She came because no one asked her to be anything, and the words settled between them with a weight that did not push but remained, and Richard exhaled slowly, his hand moving to the back of his neck in a gesture that felt unfamiliar even to himself. A small crack in the composure he had maintained. We gave her everything, he said, not defensively, but as if stating a fact he had always believed was complete, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the truth in that statement without challenging it. I believe you did, he replied, and there was no irony in his tone, no hidden judgment, only a quiet recognition that what they had given was real, even if it had not been what she needed. And Naomi stepped slightly closer to Marcus, her small hand slipping into his, her eyes moving between the adults as if trying to understand the shape of something too large for her to fully grasp, and she spoke again, softly. She used to sit on that stool, she said, pointing gently as if the object were still there, as if the memory occupied a physical space that had not disappeared, and Evelyn followed the direction of her finger instinctively, seeing nothing but empty air, and yet the image formed anyway. Uninvited but clear, her daughter sitting somewhere she had never imagined, somewhere she had never asked about, and the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, each detail pressing against the version of reality she had held onto, and she looked back down at the sketch, her thumb brushing lightly over the pencil lines. She never told us, she whispered, the words carrying a quiet fracture, not of blame, but of something more fragile, something closer to regret, and Marcus shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping away, simply remaining present in a way that did not demand space but held it. And when he spoke again, his voice was softer, not because it lacked strength, but because it understood the moment did not need more volume. Sometimes people do not say things out loud, he said, not because they want to hide them, but because they are not sure they will be heard. And the air between them changed again, not dramatically, not in a way that could be seen from a distance, but in the quiet recognition that something had been missed, not out of neglect, but out of difference. And for the first time since they arrived, Richard's gaze dropped from Marcus to the ground, then to the base of the headstone, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight he carried had shifted position, no lighter, but no longer held in the same way. Richard slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the stone bench nearby, not with the usual certainty that marked his movements, but with a hesitation that suggested he was no longer entirely sure of where he stood, his hands coming together loosely in front of him as he stared at the ground for a moment before lifting his eyes again toward Marcus, not with challenge this time, but with something quieter, something that had begun to replace certainty. And Evelyn remained where she was, still, holding the sketch, her fingers now gentler against the paper as if it were something alive, something that could be damaged if she held it too tightly, and the silence that followed was no longer guarded. It was searching, stretching, asking questions that none of them yet knew how to form into words, until Marcus reached into his worn jacket again, this time pulling out a small notebook, its cover faded, the edges softened from use, and he held it carefully, not as an object to present, but as something that carried weight beyond its size. And Naomi looked up at it immediately, her expression shifting into recognition. "That is hers," she said softly, not as a question but as a quiet certainty. And Evelyn's gaze lifted at once, drawn to the notebook in Marcus's hand, her breath slowing as if preparing herself for something she could not yet define, and Marcus nodded slightly at his daughter before looking back at Evelyn. "She left this behind," he said, his voice steady, "said I should keep it until she figured out what to do with it." And the words landed differently now, no longer strange, no longer out of place, but heavy with implication, and Richard leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his attention fixed on the notebook in a way that felt almost unfamiliar for a man who had spent his life deciding the value of things at a glance. Because this was not something that could be measured quickly, and Marcus did not open it right away. Instead, he ran his thumb lightly along the edge, a small, grounding motion, before finally turning it toward Evelyn and offering it to her, without stepping closer, giving her the space to choose. And after a brief pause, she reached out, her hand steady but slower than before, taking the notebook as if accepting something far more significant than paper and ink. And when she opened it, the pages revealed a collection of moments rather than entries, sketches mixed with sentences, unfinished thoughts, lines crossed out and rewritten, a voice trying to find itself without interruption. And she turned one page, then another, her eyes moving carefully, absorbing each fragment, each quiet confession, until one line made her stop, her breath catching just slightly as she read it silently before whispering it aloud without meaning to. "He does not try to fix me. He just lets me sit." And the words settled into the air with a stillness that felt almost sacred, and Marcus remained where he was, his posture unchanged, not watching her reaction too closely, not claiming the moment, simply allowing it to exist, while Naomi leaned gently against his side, her small presence a quiet reminder that this was not about proving anything. And Richard's gaze shifted from the notebook to Marcus, something unspoken passing through his expression, not quite understanding, not quite acceptance, but no longer dismissal. And Evelyn continued turning the pages, slower now, more carefully, as if each one required a different kind of attention. And the space around them seemed to narrow, not physically, but emotionally, as though the distance that had separated their worlds was beginning to close, not through explanation, but through the simple, undeniable presence of a life they had not fully seen. Marcus shifted slightly, letting Naomi squeeze his hand, her small presence grounding him as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cemetery path. And he spoke softly, not demanding attention but filling the space with quiet clarity. She wanted a place to hear herself think, and Evelyn's eyes lingered on him, trying to reconcile the child she thought she knew with this new layer of her memory, while Richard remained seated on the bench, silent but alert, as if every word Marcus spoke carried weight beyond comprehension. And then Marcus opened the notebook carefully, turning to a page filled with sketches of simple things: a stool, An old tire. A corner of the garage with sunlight streaming in just so. And he held it out toward Evelyn, letting her absorb the details at her own pace. Her fingers brushing the paper lightly as she recognized the lines she had seen in Lily's handwriting. The way the words and drawings mixed together, forming a rhythm that belonged to someone who had been quietly learning how to live in the spaces she chose for herself. And she whispered, almost to herself, she always needed to be seen without being told how. And Marcus nodded, acknowledging her insight without explanation, because some truths do not require defense, only recognition. And Naomi, curious and gentle, peered over the notebook, pointing at a small sketch of a chair. Is this where she liked to sit, Dad? And Marcus smiled faintly. Yes, he said. Right there. She would watch the light change over the day and think. And Evelyn felt a tug at her chest, the realization dawning that in all the moments they had missed, Lily had been finding her own quiet, her own peace, in a way that did not require their presence. And Marcus continued. She taught me that even small spaces, ordinary places, can hold a life if you let them. And Richard's hands unclenched, his shoulders loosening imperceptibly, as he processed the notion that care and presence could be more important than plans or wealth. And Evelyn held the notebook closer, letting the sketches tell her story of a daughter she thought she knew, discovering her not through objects or rules, but through moments observed and honored by someone who understood the value of simply being there. And as the shadows deepened, Marcus gathered Naomi gently in his arms, her small weight a reminder of continuity and trust, while Evelyn watched, the space between them no longer sharp or guarded, but softened by comprehension, as if grief could bend without breaking when it was met with patience and understanding. And the cemetery around them seemed to exhale, the wind shifting slightly to carry the scent of the lilies across the path, mingling with the earthy smell of the stone and soil. And in that quiet, Richard finally spoke, his voice measured and low. We never saw this side of her. And Marcus nodded once, the acknowledgement simple and unassuming. Some things can only be seen when you let them exist without trying to shape them. And Evelyn closed the notebook gently, holding it to her chest, her eyes meeting Marcus's with a new understanding, one that did not need explanation, because presence and patience had spoken louder than any words ever could. And as they all stood together, the sun now low on the horizon, long light streaking across the cemetery in gold and amber, there was a sense of calm, a quiet recognition that connection could be found even in absence, and that life, in its smallest gestures, could still teach and heal if they were willing to notice and wait. The evening air had cooled, carrying a faint scent of earth and lilies that mingled with the fading warmth of the sun, and Marcus shifted slightly, holding Naomi close, her small hands gripping his jacket as she glanced around the cemetery with a quiet curiosity, while Evelyn remained near the headstone, the notebook still in her hands, her fingers tracing the pencil lines and words that conveyed moments she had never witnessed. And Richard stood beside her, shoulders less rigid than before, absorbing the realization that some truths were not about ownership or control, but about observation and presence. And Marcus spoke softly, breaking the gentle silence without demanding it. She did not need us to be everywhere, only to be someone who would notice. And Evelyn's eyes lifted to his face, catching the steady calm in his gaze, a patience she had not expected, a constancy that did not require explanation or apology. And Naomi, sensing the change in the adults around her, leaned against her father, whispering, I think she is smiling. And Marcus smiled faintly, nodding, not correcting, simply acknowledging the perception without diminishing it. And Evelyn allowed herself to imagine it, the corners of her lips lifting subtly, a warmth spreading through her chest as she pictured her daughter finding peace in a quiet corner of a small garage, a place that had once seemed mundane but now felt sacred in its simplicity. And Richard shifted, his gaze falling to the ground briefly, contemplating the concept that presence could outweigh provision, that listening could outweigh direction. And he muttered quietly, almost to himself, we did not understand. The admission soft but filled with weight. And Marcus nodded once, the gesture deliberate, a simple acknowledgement that no further words were required. And the breeze moved again, brushing through the trees, the sound like a soft exhale over the graves, carrying with it a sense of stillness that allowed comprehension to take root. And Evelyn slowly closed the notebook, holding it to her chest, feeling the combined weight of absence and understanding, while Marcus set Naomi gently down, letting her small feet touch the gravel as she wandered slightly toward the edge of the path, her eyes bright with observation and wonder, and the adults watched, allowing the child to explore the space safely, realizing that in this moment, the quiet acts of noticing, of letting someone exist without imposition, had begun to bridge the distance between grief and memory, between presence and absence, and the shadows lengthened across the cemetery, stretching the light into bands of amber and gold that settled over the headstones, over the group standing together in a fragile alignment of understanding. And as the wind carried a small leaf past them, Marcus glanced at Evelyn and Richard, his voice calm and grounded. "She taught me to see," he said, and the words hung between them, unadorned, yet profound, and Evelyn nodded slowly, a tear slipping without effort down her cheek. Richard exhaled softly, the tightness leaving his shoulders, and for a moment, all three adults shared a silence that was neither empty nor forced, a quiet space where comprehension and acceptance could coexist. And Naomi reached for Marcus's hand again, the small gesture a reminder that life, in its gentlest forms, continued forward, quietly, patiently, and the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the cemetery bathed in the soft glow of dusk, a light that seemed to settle everything just enough for the moment to be understood without explanation. The sky had deepened into shades of navy and indigo, the last light of day slipping quietly behind the horizon, as if leaving the world in a gentle pause. And the cemetery, now bathed in the soft glow of dusk, felt like a place suspended between memory and presence, a threshold where the living and the remembered coexisted without judgment. And Marcus guided Naomi slowly along the path, her small hand wrapped in his, feeling the cool air brush against her cheeks, while Evelyn lingered near the headstone, still holding the notebook to her chest, her mind tracing each line, each sketch, each word that spoke of her daughter in ways she had never fully understood before. And Richard remained seated on the bench, his posture relaxed, yet alert, the weight of recognition settling quietly in him, the realization that sometimes care is shown not by words or actions, but by simply existing, by holding space without intrusion. And Marcus paused for a moment, looking down at Naomi as she tilted her head toward the fading light. "She used to love the quiet hours," he said, voice calm, carrying more warmth than he often allowed himself to show. "When nobody told her what to do or how to be, she could just be." And Evelyn stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the edge of the notebook as she spoke softly, almost to herself. "We never gave her that, did we?" And Marcus shook his head gently, not in blame, but in acknowledgement. "You gave her everything she needed, just not that," he said, and the simplicity of the statement struck a chord, a quiet understanding that presence could outweigh provision, that noticing could outweigh instructing. And Naomi, sensing the shift in the air, tugged lightly on Marcus's sleeve. "Will she know we tried, Dad?" she asked, her small voice tentative yet full of hope. And Marcus crouched down, looking her directly in the eyes. "She knows," he said simply. "She always knew, and that is enough." And Evelyn exhaled slowly, a breath she did not realize she had been holding, feeling some tension dissolve as she absorbed the meaning. And Richard leaned forward, slightly, hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze softening as he realized that the rigid structures he had relied on all these years could not contain what had been missing, the small, vital spaces where understanding lives. And Marcus stood slowly, letting Naomi step ahead as she paused to watch a small cluster of flowers swaying in the evening breeze. And he turned to Evelyn and Richard, his voice low and steady. "Some things cannot be told, only noticed." And Evelyn nodded, the words settling over her like a calm wave, while Richard exhaled again, allowing the last traces of defensiveness to fall away. And together they watched the shadows stretch across the graves, the wind carrying the soft scents of the lilies and earth, the quiet carrying a sense of completion, not of resolution, but of comprehension, of being present with what had been, and what continued to exist in memory, and in the small acts of recognition. And Naomi skipped lightly toward her father, her laughter, a soft echo in the cooling air, and Marcus bent slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his expression calm, steady, as if holding the moment in balance. And Evelyn finally placed the notebook gently into her bag, closing it without force, allowing the contents to remain alive in her mind, while Richard rose from the bench, adjusting his coat, and for the first time since they had arrived, the three adults and the child shared a quiet, unspoken alignment, a stillness that carried with it the understanding that connection, presence, and observation could heal spaces where grief had once lived. And as the night deepened, stars beginning to appear overhead, Marcus, Evelyn, Richard, and Naomi walked slowly together along the path, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound, a gentle accompaniment to the silent acknowledgement of lives intertwined in ways that required no explanation, only attention, only care, only the quiet act of being there. The night had fully settled over the cemetery, the stars faintly twinkling above like scattered memories, and Marcus guided Naomi along the path one last time, her small hand still clasped in his as they walked past the row of headstones, the gravel crunching softly beneath their shoes, a rhythm that seemed to mark both time and presence. And Evelyn followed closely, the notebook now safely tucked into her bag, her mind replaying every sketch, every word, every quiet act of observation that had unfolded over the past hours, allowing her to see her daughter in a way that had never been possible before, while Richard lingered near the bench, standing straighter than he had in hours, yet moving with a careful consideration, as if each step held the possibility of altering what he had just understood. And Marcus stopped at the edge of a small clearing, where the last rays of moonlight lit a single patch of grass, his gaze lifting briefly to the sky before returning to Evelyn and Richard. Some things, he said softly, are not about fixing, not about correcting, not about proving love. They are about noticing what is already there. And Evelyn felt the words settle deep in her chest, a quiet affirmation that she had been waiting for without knowing it, while Richard exhaled slowly, allowing the tension that had gripped him for so long to ebb away. And Naomi, sensing the pause, looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Will she always be here, Dad?" she asked, her voice small, yet full of wonder. And Marcus knelt, letting her curl into him, his hands steady on her back. "Yes," he said simply. "In the way she wanted, in the way she lives in our noticing, in our remembering." And Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the small clearing, imagining Lily's presence in the quiet moments Marcus had described, feeling both loss and the unexpected warmth of understanding. And Richard's eyes softened as he watched them, realizing that life's most meaningful connections were often unseen, unspoken, yet profoundly felt. And the group stood together in silence, a shared space of comprehension and recognition, where grief and memory had been transformed into quiet continuity. And Marcus straightened, taking Naomi's hand once more, letting her lead him toward the path that would take them out of the cemetery, while Evelyn followed, the weight in her chest replaced by a gentle calm, a knowledge that she had been shown what it meant to truly see and hold someone without needing to intervene. And as they walked, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of earth and lilies, a small reminder that life continued in subtle gestures, in the soft rustle of leaves, in the quiet patience of presence. And the moon rose fully, bathing the path ahead in a pale silver light, guiding them forward not with urgency but with clarity, as if the world itself was acknowledging the lessons they had been given. And Marcus glanced back briefly, his expression steady, unassuming, a silent acknowledgement that what had been shared was enough, that some truths, once noticed, could never be taken away. And Evelyn, Richard, and Naomi moved forward beside him, their steps light, their hearts quietly aligned with the understanding that had been gifted to them, a stillness that carried more weight than words ever could. And together, they left the cemetery, carrying the presence of what had been honored, what had been seen, and what would continue to live in memory, in attention, and in the gentle acts of noticing that marked the beginning of a new understanding of love, connection, and life.